Hello fellow bibliophiles and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa and today I would like to discuss with you the theme of spinsterhood in Jane Austen's works. It is a truth universally acknowledged that Jane Austen is well known for her marriage plots. All of her main 6 novels end in one and sometimes more marriages, and it's no coincidence that arguably her 2 most famous characters, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, are a couple. But what does Jane have to say about situations where marriage does not occur? What does Jane have to say about old maids and spinsterhood? And why is marriage such a big deal in the first place in Jane Austen's works? Well, Regency society organized itself around marriage and the family, and it was generally considered unnatural for a woman to remain single. Women at the time were identified in local tax and judicial records by marital status as either spinsters, wives, or widows, whereas men were identified by occupation or social status. This means that a woman's basic identity and legal existence itself was centered around their marital status. If you were a female and you were not married and having kids and running a household, who were you? What purpose did you serve in society? Marriage was also not necessarily about finding love and a lifelong partner as we think of it today, but more of a financial transaction and necessity. Sure, if you were somehow independently wealthy enough to thrive alone, spinsterhood would not be an issue. You could run a household and maintain your standard of living without the need for additional income. This is probably the main reason why Emma isn't particularly concerned about finding a husband. She's rich enough to live out her days in Highbury, comfortably matchmaking for others. But for other characters, like the Bennet sisters or Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood, the prospect of remaining unmarried translates into poverty and homelessness. Women without independent means could avoid poverty and homelessness by either finding employment or being entirely dependent on their male relatives. The only respectable and acceptable employment for the genteel was a governess, though, which of course required education and training, and not every woman possessed or even had access to this type of training. Besides, governesses had strange positions in society. The governess was quite a lonely and isolating position within a household. They weren't quite family, nor exactly were they servants, and therefore they didn't really socialize with either group. Women who were dependent on their relatives, however, were expected to make themselves useful to those relatives who took them in. So despite keeping a house for those relatives, nursing the sick, taking care of their kids, cooking, cleaning, etc., they were still viewed as a burden, and they were really at the whims of their relations. The most notable spinster in the whole of Austen's work is obviously Miss Bates of Emma, who I will definitely talk about in a little bit. But besides her, there really aren't any other spinsters, unless I'm forgetting someone. Maybe Nancy Steele could be considered a spinster, but please tell me if I'm forgetting someone. There are plenty of characters in Jane Austen's works who face spinsterhood in some fashion, though. Emma has no aspirations to marry. Anne Elliot, at the ripe old age of 27, seems destined to become an old maid when persuasion begins, and she does spend most of her time in the book functioning as an old maid. Charlotte Lucas of Pride and Prejudice marries Mr. Collins not because she loves him, but because she is getting to an age where the pickings are becoming slim and her chances of spinsterhood were very likely. And then, of course, there's the important fact that Jane Austen was a spinster herself. There was a period of time where she did flirt with the family friend Tom Lefroy, and of course she was engaged to Harris Bigwither for a day, but ultimately she never married. Many people speculate on why this is, and Katie has a really great video about Jane Austen and why she never married, which I will link down below. But I personally think and agree with Katie that it's because Jane knew that if she did marry, she would sacrifice her identity as an author, and she would need to run a household instead, and she would rather raise her characters to maturity than actual children. Regardless, Austen's decision to remain single makes how she portrays the prospect of spinsterhood all the more interesting. So let's look at the main spinster in Jane Austen's works, and that is Miss Bates. Miss Bates is a character who never stops talking. She can definitely be seen as a humorous character, but her incessant chatter and gossip dominate large sections of the text. There's one section in Volume 2 of Emma where Miss Bates rambles on about Jane Fairfax for over 3 pages, while Emma can barely get a word in edgewise. It's very easy for me as a reader to either overlook Miss Bates and skim her sections of dialogue or simply find her incredibly annoying. Part of me even begins to laugh at Miss Bates instead of with her at times. The reader's attitude, and certainly my attitude with regards to Miss Bates, is partially due to Emma's captivating narrative style. As readers, we are so entrenched in Emma's perspective and her delusions that we miss key elements of the world around her. We frequently misunderstand characters because Emma has a fundamental misunderstanding of them herself. Frank Churchill, Mr. Elton, need I say more? Emma's narrative voice and the way she so unassumingly deceives the reader is what makes this novel so fascinating to me. But I think that my perceptions of Miss Bates need to be carefully examined because they are so heavily clouded by Emma's opinions of her. Miss Bates grew up as a gentlewoman, well respected by Highbury, but she never married. Her father and her brother died, and she and her aging widow of a mother live together and are wholly dependent on the goodwill of their neighbors. They get pork from Mr. Woodhouse and apples from Mr. Knightley. Everything they have provided for them is provided by the charity of their community, and yet they are still on visiting terms with the best of Highbury society. If Miss Bates is really such a silly and not respected character, as Emma herself would have us believe, why is it that she is constantly being invited to all of these social events? Is it pity, or is it that others actually want her there? Miss Bates, while quite loquacious, is also such a sweet, generous, kind, and thoughtful character. Emma is openly cruel to Miss Bates and embarrasses her during the famous Box Hill incident. And how does Miss Bates react? Rather than anger, she blushes and she is mortified. And when Emma comes to apologize, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure she never overtly does, Miss Bates actually welcomes her. She is, quote, happy and obliged, and compliments Emma numerous times, saying that she's always so kind, which really isn't true. But Miss Bates has a heart of gold, even if the reader and Emma fail to recognize it at times. Miss Bates's speech is something truly fascinating in Emma. Austen allows Miss Bates to dominate such large narrative passages and even silence the heroine with her banter. This gives Miss Bates an agency and a power within the text. One might argue that nothing she says is important, that she is simply a gossip. But the reaction from her audience states otherwise. When Miss Bates talks, people around her listen, or at least give the appearance that they are listening. Miss Bates's speech is a form of empowerment. Yes, her circumstances are reduced, but that does not mean that she doesn't garner the respect and attention from everyone besides Emma, that is. And elements of Miss Bates's gossip are useful and actually play quite an important role in the community of Highbury and the development of the plot of the book. Miss Bates educates the reader and other characters about events in the community. Her ramblings provide information about everyone from Mr. Knightley and the gentry to some of the more common townsfolk to even the housekeeper of Donwell. She functions like a newsletter to the town, connecting all the classes and characters and keeping them well informed. Because of her socially marginalized status as a spinster, she's actually able to interact with both the gentry and the townsfolk in a way that others simply cannot. Even though she's not a wife or a mother, she's able to contribute to society in her own way by keeping the entire town informed and connected. She's a vital character to the narrative of Emma and the society of Highbury as a whole. Even if we acknowledge that Miss Bates as a spinster is given a unique and vital role in Emma, it doesn't necessarily mean that Austen's work glorifies or even redeems the spinsters. Her heroines still ultimately get married. In fact, many of her heroines show courage, bravery, and a fortitude of character by turning down proposals, even though they know that they may be resigning themselves to a life of spinsterhood. In the end, they are rewarded for their bravery by marriage. So, though there are many characters who consider spinsterhood or get close to spinsterhood, the lack of true spinsters is notable in Austen's work. So, what do you think of spinsters in Austen's work? Can you think of other spinsters and how they might be portrayed? Do you think Austen identified with Miss Bates as a character in some ways? Are there aspects of Austen's work that might point to her perspective on spinsterhood? This is just a really interesting topic to think about, and I'd love to hear any insights into what you think of the matter. Jane Austen July is almost over, and I hope you are having a great time and continue to relish Jane Austen's works during the last few days of this readathon. I'm sure I will do a Jane Austen July wrap-up in the near future. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!